Пані і панове, доброго дня. Я радий привітати вас на нашому заході. Сьогодні в гостях у Національному музеї історії України у Другій світовій війні відомий дослідник, непересічна людина, цікавий співбесідник. Я в цьому вже переконався під час короткої зустрічі, кілька хвилин, і перебування пана Ґрега Міллса у нашому музеї. Пан Ґрег Міллс – доктор філософії, директор з Brenthurst Foundation, Південно-Африканська Республіка, автор понад 70 публікацій про Україну, учасник місії на лінії фронту, стратегічний радник президентів Малаві, Кенії, Замбії та інших європейських, африканських країн. І ми дуже раді, що публічна промова, публічна лекція пана Ґрега Міллса відбудеться саме у нашому музеї. Ми раді вітати його і запрошуємо на сцену. Welcome, dear Mr. Ґрег Міллс, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was saying to the Director General that I was last in this museum 25 years ago. And so much has changed in 25 years. The museum has changed enormously, and I'd like to congratulate him and his staff for an incredible resource and a facility. And of course, Ukraine has changed so much in those 25 years, as you have gradually removed yourselves from a Soviet history of oppression, of claustrophobia, of stifled national identity, to where you are today. So it's with a degree of pride, but also a degree of humility that I stand here to speak a little bit about my subject of expertise, which is how wars begin, how wars are prosecuted, how they're carried out, and also how sometimes they end. And this is based on a book that I recently published, and the Ukrainian edition came out this week. I recently published with a colleague of mine, and we worked together in Afghanistan for different countries, but to the same objective. So we got to know each other well 15 years ago, and after spending a lot of time in Ukraine, we decided to publish this book on looking at comparative conflicts around the world. So I don't have any notes. I'm going to speak to you just from my presentation. You're very welcome to have a copy of my presentation should you so wish, and I'm sure it can be forwarded to you by the museum. So I've been to Ukraine 13 times in all, 11 times since the start of the war, 12 times if you include the fact that I got to the border on the 24th of February 2022, and of course never got any further. As some of my colleagues will know, I was the one person going in the opposite direction. Everybody seemed to be coming out of Ukraine. I think I was the only person trying to go into Ukraine on that day. One of the things we have done is bring many international visitors to Ukraine, starting with the leader of the opposition in South Africa, who is now a minister, and he is a very powerful advocate for the Ukrainian cause. Also the leaders of the oppositions in Tanzania and in Uganda on separate visits, and then the Archbishop of Cape Town. And then last year we brought a large group of international figures, including presidential candidates from Argentina and from Colombia, to visit Ukraine. I've been very, very fortunate to traveling around large areas of your country in the process. Several visits to Kharkiv, Izium, Kherson, Odessa, for example, and of course many visits to Lviv and Kiev. So have some appreciation of the differences across different regions in your country. And that was the last most recent visit that we were on. And then this is this visit, which included a presentation at the Kiev Security Forum of this book last week. As I said, a lot of what I write about and I'm going to present to you today is based on my 4 tours in Afghanistan with the International Security Assistance Force in 2006, 2010, 2012, and again in 2021, when I spent quite a lot of time inside the presidential palace in trying to understand the terms and conditions for peace in the region, particularly with Pakistan. And that, of course, ended very badly, as we know. And I would argue at the outset that what happened in Afghanistan was an encouragement to President Putin to launch his invasion, his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, less than 6 months after the fall of the government in Kabul to the Taliban. There are many lessons to be taken out of Afghanistan. I wrote a book called The Ledger about those lessons in Afghanistan. There are many lessons to be taken out about counterinsurgency warfare and what to do and what not to do. And I think the most important thing for me is that those lessons were lessons that most of the world had learnt back in various other conflicts, but particularly the Americans had learnt in Vietnam. And the fact that they had to relearn them in Afghanistan says something about us as people. We tend to relearn the same lessons over and over again. And the fact that, in fact, many of the different headquarters, the different rotations within Afghanistan learnt the same lesson in Afghanistan over and over again says something again about us as human beings. We tend not to reflect on the experience of others, I believe, enough. We tend to always think that we are unique, that we have a very special outlook, or that we are going to do things differently. But as you see from this long list, and don't worry, I'm not going to read through the long list, I'm simply going to summarize it for you at the end. Many of these lessons that I identify, the so-called do's and don'ts, the left-hand and right-hand column, will be very familiar to any student of international politics, or indeed any student of military science, about what to do and what not to do. And there are many, many lessons to be learnt. And I say the extraordinary part is that we tend to forget them as quickly as we've learnt them, or ignore the fact that they've been learnt by others. But essentially, this boils down to a handful of lessons. And the first of these, very simply, is in the case of Afghanistan, the original sin, the original problem was that no political deal was struck. The Americans in particular, but their allies as well, right after the fall of the Taliban, believed that it wasn't necessary to include the Taliban in a political deal, that they were defeated and that they had their own democratic formula or version of Afghan version of a democratic formula to be able to bring about a different type of rule in Afghanistan. Of course, what this meant was that the Taliban were excluded, a little bit like the Ba'ath Party in Iraq was excluded after Saddam Hussein's departure in 2003. And this gave them very little alternative but to continue to fight, to regroup, mostly in Pakistan, and then to launch themselves back into the military struggle over time. And the longer this went on, of course, the more likely it was that it had the conclusion that it eventually had in 2021, because the Taliban knew that the longer they survived, the less likely it was that the Americans or the American-led coalition would in itself survive, and the time was on their side. There's an Afghan expression that you have the watches, you have the wristwatches, but we have the time. We are able to simply wait you out in this process. So the original sin was that they didn't make a political deal with the Taliban. The second was that although the West likes to believe that it won every battle that it fought in Afghanistan, the fact of the matter is they lost the war. Their best was not good enough. It may have been their best. It may not have been their best. We can debate that. But it was not good enough to defeat the Taliban where they were. And the consequences of this was that, of course, as I said, the Taliban simply had to survive until the West decided that they'd had enough and wanted to go away. And the more people that the Western-led coalition or their partners in the Afghan security forces, the more people that they injured or that they killed, the less likely there was of any sort of political settlement, given very old-fashioned honor codes among the Afghan people. So they sought vengeance as a consequence of those deaths, and the more people that got killed, the more likely it was that this was only ever going to have one military ending. There was a lack fundamentally of long-term commitment. The period of recovery in war or from war is at least as long as the period of fighting or of decline. And the problem is that while stamina, while patience is the greatest warrior of all, it's the greatest force that you can possess. Unfortunately, the West does not have that level of political patience. They have very short political cycles. In the United States, it's only 4 years and a maximum of 8 years, of course, for one president. And in most other democracies, it's between 4 to 6 years, which means the turnover in political cycles is much shorter than the period that you need to commit yourself to in a place like Afghanistan to enable recovery. So the potential or the opportunity, the prospect of long-term commitment in Afghanistan was never going to happen. The West spent in total about $3 trillion. That's $3,000 billion. Let me rephrase that. That's $3,000 million in Afghanistan. That includes future commitments to those who were injured or to their families. So a massive amount of spending, probably something in the order of between $150 to $200 billion in development assistance alone. And frankly, it was a complete and utter waste of money. It made the elites wealthy. It didn't deliver development. In fact, it interfered with development on the ground in many cases. It didn't change the very system that people were operating in. Because the West came with a set of values as well as some ideas, they attacked certain things like drugs, for instance, and the drug-producing areas, particularly of Helmand, when they would have been much better off leaving those well alone. So aid had a very, very poor set of results. It certainly didn't make the Afghan people rich. It may have made some of those delivering the aid rich, and it may have made some warlords rich, but it didn't make the Afghans rich. And then there was a lack of regional alignment. And I might say this again, but peace is always a product of three components. Firstly, you need to have an awareness by all the fighting parties that there's more to be gained by ending fighting than there is by continuing with it. That's the first point. There's more to be gained if they stop fighting, and they both realize that. The second thing you need everybody pushing the parties to the negotiating table. There's no point in having one regional actor, powerful one in this instance in Pakistan, not pushing the parties to the negotiating table because they're playing domestic politics in Afghanistan. And thirdly, you need leadership, and you need method, and you need timing. And in each of those different three areas, a willingness to settle, leadership, method, and timing, and regional alignment, there wasn't simply the right degree of commitment for there to be peace in Afghanistan. So, bearing that in mind and bearing all the lessons I have learned from that and other conflicts, what does this mean for Ukraine? And I'm going to look at three different areas. The first is I'm going to make some strategic observations. Then I'm going to make some operational observations, things I have seen over my dozen visits. And then I'm going to talk to you about 4 possible scenarios in the process. So what are the big lessons? Well, the first big lesson is for me that there was a clear misreading by Russia of what Ukraine was about. This morning we were in Hostomel, and we heard from the people who were involved in the fighting in Hostomel on the 24th of February, how they managed to fight back or delay the Russian special forces landings, prevent their aircraft from landing, but that the Russians were very surprised by the level of resistance. I think Russia had misread the willingness on the part of the Ukrainian people to be part of a greater Russian-led empire. That much is very clear. And I think that Russia continues probably to misread the strength of Ukraine. To quote your former prime minister, your country is bruised but not broken, tired but not exhausted. And I think the Russians probably think you're more exhausted than you are and more broken than you may be. And they continue to misread. I think that the second strategic observation I would make is that the West has got it wrong. They have given you just enough that you are not defeated, but they have not given you enough to ensure that Russia loses. So that you don't lose, but that Russia also doesn't lose. And the problem with this is that Russia will then, of course, always see opportunity for continuing the struggle. There will be no deterrence. And, of course, what they have spent in Ukraine has been relatively small by the standards of their overall defense contribution, about 0.1% of GDP, when, on average, most European countries are spending 2% on GDP. And what better place to spend a bigger chunk of that 2% than in Ukraine? And I think there's been in this a failure to see Russia for what it is. I think that's improved. People have pretended to see Russia for what they would like to see it as. And I do think in all of this there's something of, and this is a Vietnam era comment, a credibility gap on the part of the West. So many speeches about delivering more and more aid, more and more military assistance, but less is forthcoming than the promises. There's lots of talk, but less action than is required. I think that we've been surprised by the shocking ineffectiveness of Russia's troops, but I do think that while this is seen as Putin's war, and of course he's made it about himself, going back to his speeches in 2005 and 2007, I mean, he set the stage for what is to follow, and of course the actions in Georgia, and then the actions in Chechnya, and then of course in 2014. This is also not just a war about Putin. It is also a war about the Russian people. And I think for me that remains one of the most extraordinary bits, is that these are people who have been comparatively hard done by in terms of development. But because of the circumstances perhaps that they live in, they continue to see the world in terms different to many of us who have exposure to Western liberal media. And perhaps that's the answer, that they don't have that exposure. They only hear what they're allowed to hear. I think that there's a very contested narrative out there. It still is very contested. I'll come back to this in a moment about the global south, where I'm from South Africa, and indeed from much of Africa, and many of the so-called BRICS countries, which represent many of those thoughts in Africa and elsewhere in the world. It does show, this war, that a suitable narrative can make all the difference. I mean, it's clear that at the beginning of the war, Putin's speeches about denazification really probably cost him more support than he gained. But the Russians have been able to, through a combination of simplicity of their message and consistency of their half a dozen or so messages that they continuously lay out. This is a war because NATO didn't stick by its deals. This is a war of a minority in Ukraine, etc., etc. They've been able to dominate a large part of the media space, much more so than they deserve. And that's also because they control many of the outlets, and they're good at it. RT, Sputnik, and so on. They've actually done better in the media space than you would have imagined, given that they are the invading power. And they have, of course, made it partly about land, but of course it's not a war about land at all. Given the size of Russia, it's a war about values, it's a war about security, it's a war about a different worldview, as President Zelensky has put it. I think it represents geopolitical fracture. The world is completely different now to what it was before the 24th of February 2022, 3 and a bit years ago. The world is a much more dangerous place. It's much more about raw power, about the need to prepare for war, to gear yourselves up in terms of defense spending and training. The rules-based international order appears to be completely on its deathbed, but nothing has replaced it yet. There's talk about the BRICS replacing it or some form of adjustment being made, but the order that we know, which has delivered a degree of international security since 1945, at great cost, but a degree of international security, that order appears to be completely broken. And perhaps the most broken institution of all is the one at the center of it, which is the United Nations. And increasingly, regional bodies have become the means of delivering stability and security and, of course, economic and political integration. I think the other big strategic message, and this is the big difference with Afghanistan, is the importance of agency. Ukrainians have not lost agency at any point in this war. Even in the darkest moments of the Oval Office a couple of months ago, Ukraine has shown that it is at the center of the struggle, that there is an active executive, that even in a war situation, that there's an active check and balance within the political framework between the parliament and the executive. So Ukrainians have agency, and I think that this is one of the fundamental things that Russia has failed to understand. It has this image of Ukraine in its mind, which is completely out of sync with the reality that most Ukrainians feel. Increasingly, as Clausewitz said, and how many of you are students of military history? Any of you? How many are students of history? Anybody? One there, 2, 3, 4, 5. Don't be shy. I'm a student of history. 5. Any give me more than 5? Well, you'll know that Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means. Well, in a sense, the economy is war by other means. And increasingly in this sort of conflict, this has become a war about isolation, about sanctions, which is as important in terms of undercutting the Russian military effort as it is about signaling to the Russians and to their elite that they can't get away in this world with this type of behavior. But of course, there are problems. Sanctions are a very, very difficult tool to implement. It's very hard to even know how much impact it's having. But it is because, of course, Russia is not an open society in terms of the information flow on the economy. And to deliver effective sanctions against Russia, you ostensibly need secondary sanctions against the likes of India and China, among many others. And in fact, Europe has been very slow on the sanctions front. The German addiction to cheap energy has meant that, in a sense, Germany, while delivering missiles, or maybe delivering missiles, is also delivering money to Russia, or has been. And that makes it kind of a schizophrenic partner in all of this. It's the end of the McDonald's thesis, otherwise known as the Golden Arch thesis, which was the idea that democracies or countries with a certain standard of living don't go to war with each other. I think that's been replaced by a thesis that says that standards of living are not as important as political systems. That where you have an authoritarian system and a democratic system, that in spite of the level of living standards, you can end up fighting each other. And authoritarians have many advantages in this regard. They don't have to answer to their people. They can force their people into economic hardship, and they can take much higher casualties than in a democracy. And that gives them a certain advantage in these types of wars. Everyone thought that in 1989 that the world's history had ended, as Francis Fukuyama put it, that the end of history was nigh. Well, in fact, it wasn't. It turned out that history is still with us. It's back. Things are changing all the time. It's an extremely dynamic environment, and not everybody wants to be like America. And that may be more the case today than it's ever been before, actually. They may want to be more like bits of Europe, perhaps, than they want to be like America. But it undermines the idea that economic globalization, like the McDonald's thesis, will make war less likely. But it's becoming more about other ambitions and aims, and particularly about raw minerals, about resources. And that is, of course, something which is center now of the Ukrainian peace story, but is also very much part in Africa of the war story, about the fight for resources, including water. As I said, one of the big strategic awarenesses out of this campaign is how the global south is not really following the line that's been taken by the West. Although the West represents 2/3 of the world's economic power and wealth, the majority of people, as represented by the global south, actually don't agree with the Western view on this war. At least their governments don't agree with the Western view on this war. It's much more the case that their people are sympathetic to Ukraine, but the governments have taken a far more, I think, skeptical view, because they don't want to offend Russia on the one hand, they're fearful of Russia on the other, and in some cases they want to be just like Russia. No chance of losing power in an election, and lots of opportunities to make yourself exceedingly wealthy. So the global south is more or less adrift from the Western narrative. But I think that where Ukraine has been enormously successful, and sorry, I should just say, one of the problems with Ukraine's narrative on the war with the global south is this play of victimhood, is this play of weakness. And many Africans fear this, will see this for what it is. They see it as a threat to their own political positioning. They also are fearful of the response from, as I said, from Russia, but also from China, where they have developed very strong relationships over the last several years. But Ukraine has put itself at the center of European security, and I think the critical thing is how Europe backs up this realization, but also how Ukraine adjusts its narrative to make it not just a recipient, but a shaper, but a participant in the debate around its role in European security. And then there's increasingly a divide globally between authoritarians, who tend to support Russia, of course, and more liberal-minded people. And the problem in this is that increasingly today, democracies are losing the overall struggle or overall position in the global political economy to authoritarians. We're in the 20th year of a deterioration, a decline in democratic standards worldwide. And of course, this affects Africa in particular. We have just 10 democracies out of 54 African countries, or 10 fully free democracies. And of course, this is in the interests of countries like China, which have their own view about representative democracy, which doesn't align with the Western view about representative democracy. Let me briefly make some operational comments. I think the first of these is that increasingly what we see in Ukraine is a war without people through mechanized warfare, but mechanized warfare not just on land, but in drone warfare in particular, which helps to offset some of the disadvantages that Ukraine faces in terms of manpower. But the level of sophistication and increasingly technological sophistication of drones in the last 3 years is quite remarkable. And Ukraine is undoubtedly, because war is the mother of all necessity, is undoubtedly a leader in this regard. Although many people predicted that this was the end of the tank of armored warfare, I think what we've seen is that the tank is there, but that it has to be employed differently to the way in which it has been traditionally employed. It's much more useful on a counter-attack than on a full frontal attack, for example. And a lot of equipment was squandered, possibly on both sides, by misuse of armor in this age of the drone. Increasingly, it's about the speed of engagement. It's about the pace at which you are able to engage your enemy and to get within the decision-making cycle. And that is not a question only of hardware. Hardware is important. It's a question of software. And software is not just about stuff in your computer and the ability of computers to talk to each other. It's also about the human interface. It's about training, and it's about the way in which you deploy that level of equipment. And then, while that is all happening at one level, what we've seen in this war is that while the West has favored maneuver warfare, you've seen increasingly attritional warfare, where the sides have come up against each other in a war that resembles more 1914-18 than it does even 1939-45 in terms of maneuver warfare. Big defenses, inability to get around those defenses, very deep minefields, stacked and fortified in a way that makes it extremely difficult to cross and become increasingly attritional. And I said that's a war that generally favors the authoritarian because of the casualties and because of the duration of that war, because of the way in which you have to gear your economy and the circumstances. Although people say that in such a war of attrition, the art of war is lost, partly the title of our book, about the ability to use your forces effectively, it's not lost completely. And I'll come back to this in a moment in terms of some of the scenarios that I would outline. I think that the failure to utilize the art of shaping your opponent, of artfully using your resources, cost Ukraine very dearly in the 2023 counteroffensive, because you essentially threw your forces against this multi-layered Russian defense. NATO is, of course, has come out of this war looking much better than it did going into it. It's bigger, with the addition of Finland and Sweden, but it's also highlighted many operational flaws within NATO, not least its interoperability, its use of multiple weapons types, where the United States is comparatively rationalized, and this is a very complex environment as a result. So this has highlighted, I think, some big operational weaknesses which NATO is aware of. There's still a place for the foot soldier. The drone may be coming and may be a critical part of future warfare, but trained infantry is still required. Someone's got to operate the drone, someone's got to fill in the gaps and backfill in these areas. And of course, it's a function, the effectiveness of infantry is a function of education, of training, of motivation, of coherence, of what you would call esprit de corps. And all of those remain as important today as they were in warfare throughout the ages. And of course, recruitment is the other side of this. It becomes much easier to recruit when you're winning. It becomes much easier to recruit when you've got something clear that you're fighting for. Now let me turn to the meat in the sandwich, which is how I see some of the scenarios panning out, potentially, topically, with a peace process occurring even as we speak. And of course, much of it depends on whether this peace is permanent or whether it's temporary, but I'm going to make some comments about that in terms of looking at these scenarios. The first scenario is what I would call the Litvak scenario. Edward Litvak is an American strategist, and he coined the term give war a chance, essentially allow parties to fight it out to the point that they either reach mutual stalemate and then they sue for peace, or that one side wins and the other side loses, and so peace becomes more like that in 1945, for example, becomes occupation and defeat, or even that in Afghanistan. But this, of course, is a very costly strategy on the one hand. It may escalate uncontrollably on the other, particularly if the Russians lose. And of course, it does require enormous volumes of Western assistance. And that's going to be quite difficult to predict with President Trump in the White House. It's not clear that he has that appetite for supporting a war that he does not see, apparently, a direct interest for the United States. The second scenario is that you get a peace and you have an armistice signed, and that you end up with a fixed line around territory, as happened between the two Koreas, with the guarantees of China, the United Nations, and the United States, among the other intervening powers on the side of the United Nations in July 1953. And more or less, that's where they ended, and that's where they are today on the 38th parallel, dividing the peninsula more or less in the middle. Under this option, while the sides keep their territorial claims intact, there's very little movement, and more or less it becomes fixed where the armistice is signed. The third scenario is that of a peace sticking, and then you create a German scenario where you have a divide, and then over multiple generations, in the case of Germany, a generation and a half, 35 years, eventually the two bits are reunited. In some ways, this is an appealing scenario because there's a prospect of uniting. It's never off the table. And it's also appealing because it means that you don't have to immediately pay for the rebuilding of all the destruction in the areas that Russia has occupied. But of course, it's going to be very hard for any politician to be able to sell this to the Ukrainian public, given what this war has been about. But this recognizes the facts on the ground as they are, rather than as they should be in terms of international law and in terms of political sentiment in the West. And then there's the fourth and perhaps most interesting option. Field Marshal Bill Slim was a very famous general, probably the best fighting general on the side of the British in the Second World War, and he did not attack the Japanese in a full frontal assault. He never had the troops for that. What he did was he led the Japanese 15th Army in, and he gradually degraded them and ultimately destroyed them. This option recognizes that there's a peace, but it's only temporary, and that Ukraine would have to build up its resources, prepare itself for the next round in this multi-round contest to be able to win this war, that this temporary armistice wouldn't hold for more than an 18-month to 3-year period, for instance. And it's what it did in that gap that would become all important to winning the war. So what is a theory of victory for Ukraine? Michael Howard, the great British strategist, spoke about a theory of victory. We can call it a theory of peace, of sustainable peace, of achievable peace, something that looks like a plan that we can make and we can adhere to. And this has to be based on the nature of war as much as it's based on predictions or ideas. And it's about fundamentally drawing in others to this plan, because you're going to need external assistance to be able to sustain this approach, to launch this plan at the very outset. The first of these issues in this theory of victory would be that you'd have to create the idea of Ukraine as a defense hub. I think there's a big sign outside this museum that says Ukraine as a shield for Europe. We drove past it going reasonably fast, so I wasn't 100% certain, but that's the same idea here, about Ukraine as a shield for Europe, at the center of Western security, but not just at the center of Western security in terms of receiving Western assistance, but also at the center of European security in terms of the provision of expertise, of defense thinking, of technology, of modern warfare. Because it's my estimation that what I've seen in Ukraine, despite the difficult economic circumstances, is really top class, top notch at a technological level in terms of anything that I've seen elsewhere in the world. So Ukraine would make itself tougher, a much harder nut to crack, while strengthening its own economy. But of course, to do this, it would have to have a willingness to integrate with defense manufacturers around the world, to be able to share its IP, of course, in this process of rebuilding. It would, in so doing, splice itself into Europe. I don't believe that NATO membership is likely at this juncture, but European Union membership is more likely, and that'll come with a certain number of guarantees. But it's the splicing of economic interests, of defense interests, that will drive this over the long term. And essentially providing yourselves as both a bulwark against a defense against Russia, but also as an exporter of defense capital. I used to work for a man called General Sir Nick Carter, who was the Chief of Defense Staff in the UK, and he has this idea of Ukraine making itself into an indigestible porcupine. And I think it's a very good way of thinking about your defense posture, about actually constructing a defensive system that Russia can never swallow you. It's going to get itself hurt in the process. It's about being able to defend, but also draw in the Russians if they did launch another attack, and then degrade them in the manner that Bill Slim would have done to the Japanese in 1944. Training is a huge priority. You're not going to do this without training people about strategic awareness at the top level, but also building a meaningful reserve for this almost inevitable second round clash. And you would need to think about deterrence. You need to think about strategic ambiguity in terms of signaling that you were looking for or thinking about creating at least tactical nuclear weapons as a long-term defensive need. A Wunderwaffe is a German word, of course, looking for wonder weapons. I don't believe they exist, but that what you need to do is be able to knit together a combination of what you have with perceptions of what you will do with them, and perceptions of what you're trying to possess and what you're trying to build. And that helps to create a defensive as well as a deterrence capacity. I think the idea of Ukraine fighting an ethical war is absolutely at the center of your narrative about building a support base which goes beyond states, which links up with people. I'm not sure what the Ukrainian narrative of victory is, other than get the Russians out. What is that strategy? What's that pathway to victory look like? How would you label this war 3 years in, when the interests on the part of the international community are starting to flag? And I'm somewhat affected by my experience in Afghanistan, because literally weeks after the fall of Kabul, nobody had any interest in Afghanistan. They were more worried about dogs and cats in Afghanistan than they were about people in Afghanistan. They're more worried about what Afghanistan meant for them and what their feelings were than the feelings of the Afghans. And the danger is, in this highly self-referential world that we live in, where everyone is worried about, through these devices, about what they think and about how they feel, that you will lose the international community unless you are able to pitch this in a way that appeals to the individual person. And it's a sort of bottom-up approach. And you're going to think very carefully about putting people at the center of this narrative. As I said, it's more about returning to the art of war. And of course, then you've got to work to continue to ramp up sanctions, to increase the cost of those who are circumventing sanctions, to make it clear who are benefiting from the war and profiting from the war, no matter where those individuals might be. I think Ukraine's done a very good job in this regard, but clearly it needs to continue on this track in order to be able to constrain the Russian economy even further. And of course, China's role in this is increasingly important. They're part of this. They're one of the friends of steel, to use Putin's term, and they are massively important suppliers to the Russian war machine, in terms of chips, in terms of machine tools, in terms of all the high-tech stuff that's needed to sustain the approach that the Russians have taken. There's a lot of question about how to use the $300 billion in frozen funds. That has to remain a topic, I think, on the international agenda, probably driven in institutions like the European Parliament, for instance, which is increasingly finding its voice around human rights. And there's some proper work and lobbying that needs to be done around an ethical war and what to do with this unethically acquired, in some instances, money. And perhaps the answer to that is to use that money for defensive purposes, to seed those defense industries of the future that we're talking about. Because one of the challenges in defense spending is the cost of borrowing. You can't borrow because it's for defense. And so banks are very squeamish, they're very uncomfortable about lending money for defensive purposes. And then, of course, there's a variable of time. There's more time in Zelensky's favor, there's more time in Putin's favor. Perhaps until a month or two ago, I would have said it's probably in Putin's favor, but clearly Putin has upset the Americans more than President Zelensky has, and is clearly out of favor in this regard. So there is the variable of time. And one of the interesting questions here is President Putin playing for peace in order to be able to force an election in Ukraine at this time? That's a sort of unstated question out there. It's a risky approach for the Russians, but it's a risky approach that costs very little in terms of their media machine. As I said, you need this narrative of victory, and not a narrative of victimhood, not a narrative that we need your stuff, we need your money, we need your help. That doesn't really develop you. I know you need it, but you need a narrative of collaboration, of partnership, of prosperity, of strength. People are attracted by narratives of strength. They're not attracted by narratives of weakness, because they know that absent their contribution, that you will, as you say yourselves, not yourselves, Ukraine, but as any weak power would say, that they will collapse without international assistance. You need to portray a narrative of ethical strength as well as financial and military strength. Joining the EU is not going to be enough on economic reconstruction. There's something to do with economic financial reconstruction, which has to take place. That has to happen in a parallel discussion, particularly on non-performing loans and where you're going to borrow money from into an economy which has governance concerns, such as one here. You need to think about how you're going to attract the global south, how you're going to, I think it's partly answered by the strength versus weakness narrative, but about how you position yourselves. And a lot of that is to do with positioning yourselves as a partner of people rather than as a partner of governments. And I know that's a very delicate path to try and steer. But for example, in Africa, about half now, about 30 of 54 African countries support Ukraine in the United Nations General Assembly. That's come down because of President Trump in the last resolution. So it's roughly around half of African countries. But actually in political support terms, and my country, South Africa, has traditionally abstained, we recently ran a poll on support for Ukraine, and 75% of South Africans said, we think that we should help Ukraine. So actually governments and populations are disconnected, and you need to think about how you link better with people over governments. And this is particularly the case in Africa, where Russians have engaged with illegitimate, illegal, and often very violent, undemocratic African governments, such as in the Central African Republic, or in Niger, or in Burkina Faso, or in Mali. And you need to think of constructive ways of undermining their rule, because indeed in many cases it's making the situations over the long term in those countries far worse. So there's much more work that can happen in terms of labeling and portraying the Russians as destructive actors within an African context, which go well outside of military means or military assistance, and much more about focusing on the narrative of Russia in Africa. And one of the challenges that you have here is, frankly, you have a diplomatic expansion strategy towards Africa, increasing the number of missions, but you don't have a strategy per se beyond some aid in terms of food and diplomatic expansion. There's much more need for a nuanced approach, engaging with civil society, changing the narrative of what Ukraine offers African populations and what it stands for, what its message is to Africa in terms of democracy and self-determination. So let me pull together the common threads. In both cases of Afghanistan and Ukraine, it ends and begins with politics. There's a very long period of recovery and decline, and stamina is very, very important. You need to own it yourselves. Ukraine is 1,000,000 times better than Afghanistan ever was in this regard. You must guard against being seen as a victim. Don't portray yourselves as needing the outside world's help, because that's charity, and charity inevitably disappears. You need this, say, long-term patience and stamina. Logistics is absolutely key in battle, as well as fighting spirit. And governance is key in determining the outcome. You need to build trusts and relationships. You need to get to know your partners and build linkages with those partners. That is a two-way process by definition. These processes need to avoid dealing with just leaders. They're about dealing with civil society actors. They're about building the base of engagement like we're doing here today in talking to each other. Outsiders have to watch that they lack credibility. They offer a lot and deliver much less. They need to maintain that credibility gap, and they need to be honest at all stages in the process. And they need to carefully calibrate what they're offering based on the conditions that they apply. And you need to build a strategy, not a strategy for strategy. You need to build a strategy for victory. Sorry, I was writing that late in the evening. And you need to have a long-term view of global interaction in this regard. And don't be afraid to say things in terms of what you see, as Ronald Reagan did, rather than as you would like them to be. That's going to be, that degree of honesty and building that level of trust is absolutely imperative for a long-term relationship. Let me end on a positive note, and that is that, as I say, I've been coming here for more than 3 years. This is a completely different country. When I first came here in 2000 and then 2002 on a NATO-organized discussion with your armed forces, it was a completely different place. It was like, a sort of Soviet relic in many ways. And I visited, as I say, this museum at that time, representing a completely different view of history, a view of the nuances of history that was lost actually almost in its entirety. Fast forward to 2022, this was a country shocked by what had happened. 8 years of war, then the full-scale invasion. It was economically, I think, wobbling, disorganized. And today, there's a much better spirit. There's a much greater spirit of resilience and much better levels of organization and of weapons and utilization than ever before. Of course, it's been enormously costly, and particularly in terms of the treasure of lives and lives destroyed and families broken apart in the process. And so I'm fully aware of that, which is why I'm suggesting that a theory of victory that everyone can believe in is absolutely crucial in sustaining international support according to some sort of plan that everyone can buy into. When I came at the end of 2022, I brought 2 African politicians with me, as I mentioned, Bobi Wine and Zita Kabwe. The Bobi is a singer. and a very famous singer in Africa. And we recorded 2 songs with a band in Lviv. I write songs in my spare time. I only do it to embarrass my children. And I'm going to try, if the technology works, I don't know, it's going to work, to play one of those songs for you. I'm here for any questions if you'd like to ask me. Sure.
Ukraine and Ukrainians claim Ukrainian Soviet heritage. I mean the contribution of Ukrainians, of Ukraine, into the national liberation movements, into the economic assistance, especially, and of course, into the process of independence. I'm sure you know that Ukraine initiated many resolutions in assistance of the anti-colonial struggle, and Ukraine was very active those days. I have personal reason to ask this question too, because my grandfather was ambassador of the USSR to Zambia and Botswana in 1976 for 6 years. He told me a lot about Ukrainians. He was actually born in Brenthurst, which is now a temporarily occupied territory. So, war hero and decorated officer of the Soviet Army. So, what would be your answer to this question? Thank you very much.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think there's, I think the Russians have been very good at appropriating that history to their advantage. In most part because they are seen as the inheritors of the Soviet legacy, because that's what they want to be, and you don't want to be. So because they willingly want, identify with the Soviet Union, Putin's famous comment of 2005, it was the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, which is remarkable if I'm sitting to say that when I'm sitting in this building, which honors the dead of the Second World War, and makes us remember their sacrifice, among other things. So the Russians have been able to appropriate that history. I think it's the more remarkable because essentially what Russia is doing here is a war of imperialism. It's a war of colonialism. And that point has been made by many Africans, actually, as well as by Ukrainians. And I think it's a narrative that is not strengthened enough. I think for Africa it would be one of the absolute key points to be made at every opportunity. I mean, if you think about Russian narratives, it's about half a dozen to 10 messages which are repeated over and over and over again. There have been many studies on this about which messages are repeated. And Ukraine should have a similar list of half a dozen things that it repeats for an African audience. And one of those things is this is a war of colonialism. The second of those aspects is that Ukraine contributed massively. You mentioned your grandfather, but Ukraine was one of the originators of the Anti-Apartheid Committee, and I think it's about a third, Ray, of people who were trained in the ANC's armed wing were actually trained in Odessa. And I know certainly all the naval officers were trained down on the Black Sea from Crimea. So there's lots of linkages, there's lots of connections, but the Russians have been very successful in being able to appropriate that. So that raises, as I said, the point I mentioned in my talk, which is what is Ukraine's Africa strategy look like? Which countries do you focus on? What do you do to counter Russian influence on the continent, which, by the way, will put you on the side of African people, because they're not fighting for African people. What they're doing is they're fighting for a very small elite, which in the countries I mentioned, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, for instance, Central African Republic is not elected. It's undemocratic, it's authoritarian. So how do you work with the Europeans and others to undermine their position in the interests of Africa? And here I think Ukraine has to be very careful, because if it works too closely with the West, it's going to be tainted by the West's own political colonial involvement in many of these places. So it's a very delicate road that you have to steer. But go back to the narrative. Your contribution to the anti-colonial struggle Russia as a colonial power, Russia as an authoritarian, not as a democrat, and the fact that Ukraine, even in the midst of fighting a war, is willing to provide food and aid and sustenance to Africans in need is another added dimension to this. I would just throw out one statistic. As I said, there's 54 African countries, 55 if you include the Western Sahara, and there's of those about 10 are considered to be free by Freedom House. About another 25 or so are considered, or 20 are considered to be partly free, and the rest are considered to be unfree, authoritarian. And like the rest of the world, we're moving increasingly towards being authoritarian. However, and this is the big however, more than 2/3 of Africans prefer, it's about 70%, would prefer to be living in a democratic environment than an authoritarian one. So we have this incredible contrast. On the one hand, 2/3, 70% say, excuse me, that they would prefer to be living in a democracy. 93% of Africans live in authoritarian circumstances. So that provides opportunity, because your message is actually aiming at the 70%, the people who would be prefer to living in a democratic environment, an environment that's anti-colonial, that's not about control, it's about openness and freedoms. But for that you need public diplomacy. For that you need a very strong message of strength, not victimhood, not of weakness. You need a message that plays to your past, but projects to your future. You need a message that works with civil society where you have authoritarian governments in place, and then you don't undermine yourself. My bit that would really I don't understand is why not criticize African regimes which don't vote for you in the United Nations, which actually in the case, let's say, of Uganda, the country that Bobby Wine, the singer, comes from, and he's leader of the opposition there, that are openly supporting rhetorically Russia. In fact, the head of the army has said he'll go and fight for Russia. Why not come out with a much stronger line on those countries in support of African democracy? And I think it'll win you far more friends than it costs you relationships. So I think the G20 offers a shortcut to some of that. Hopefully President Zelensky gets invited to the G20, because Putin can't be there because of the ICC warrant out for his arrest. And I don't think that will be, whatever happens in Ukraine, I'm not sure that'll be rescinded at any time soon. And President Zelensky would have an opportunity to be on a big global stage and to come out with a view on Africa that links with people, that puts people first, not politics first, and not power first. And that would be my line. Ukraine putting people first in its foreign affairs, and this ethical foreign policy, because nobody else is doing it in Africa. You could be the first. So I would just say, I agree with you. I don't think Ukraine has done enough. I don't think it's capitalized on its past record and history. And I think there's much more to be gained, but from a position of strength and from a position of weakness. Ma'am?
Hello, thank you for this lecture, for your speech. So I have two questions. The first one is that, so you told that Russia Ukraine, but what if they just what if they see the level of wellness and understand all the situation in Ukraine, but just don't want to accept it, they just don't want to deal with it, and they don't want to accept that we are independent and separate country, and that we don't need any big brother in the face of Russia. And the second question, that in your opinion, what is the most possible scenario of ending the war at this moment, and what will happen with the occupied territories, especially with Crimea? So thank you so much.
Sorry, just repeat the first question. You think it's Africa specific, or is it the perception of Ukraine? It was a question about perception on Ukraine, or...
No, I told that there was the quote that Russia is misreading Ukraine.
Yes, yes.
So what if they read our country rightly, in the right way, but just don't want to accept that we are independent, that we are separate country, and don't need anyone to head us or...
Yeah, I get it. Thank you. Let me deal with the second one first. I mean, I think it's very hard to know what's going to happen in the peace process. I find it very, very hard to imagine that Putin is going to, having lost or suffered, a million or the best part of 1 million casualties and all the losses, that he's simply going to give up on this ambition because President Trump wants him to. He might give it up on it temporarily, which is what I suggest. And then in the interim, I think Ukraine would have to really work very hard to develop a defense posture and diplomatic strategy that goes with it to be able to make itself that indigestible porcupine. I find it very hard to imagine that he's going to go, okay, that's that. We're going to hang on to these territories that we've occupied, and we're going to, create peace from this moment. I declare myself victor of this conflict. I find that hard to believe, given, the level of sacrifice and given where he's at. Unless, of course, the economic conditions in Russia are much worse than we think. That the economy is really struggling, that they're facing inflationary pressures, that he sees his own future rule being linked to withdrawing from the conflict, and that he's fearful of what the United States and other actors might do. I don't really see that as a likely scenario, though. So I think probably the one this week, but next week might be different. Looks like there will be some attempt at a ceasefire. If there is a ceasefire, that I can't imagine it's going to be forever permanent. But I would be, pleasantly surprised if that was the case. And then there would have to be, as seems to be the way now, ceasefire and then talks. I can't see the Russians retreating and disengaging from those territories. I think that's highly unlikely. And anyway, I'm not sure if Ukraine really would want that right now. So you'd have to make a virtue out of an evil, because the cost of rebuilding that while simultaneously rebuilding your army to be able to defend against what is almost inevitably going to be another round of conflict, I think would be probably more than your economy could digest. And then you've got this problem, which is the world's attention span, which is, is it still going on, that conflict, Ukraine, Russia? And people have already moved on to the third or fourth thing on their scrolling list, and that was yesterday's news. So retaining that degree of international attention is going to be crucial. I think the President did very well on this weekend about getting the international leadership here, about keeping the focus on Ukraine, and that will have to be retained over the long term. So I don't want to sound negative, but I think that maybe this week there's a possibility of a ceasefire, but I don't know if there's anybody in this room who believes it's going to hold, and you can hold Putin to his word on that. I wouldn't bet my pension on it, sadly. What if they are deliberately misreading Ukraine? We don't really know, do we? Because you can't really trust anything that comes out of Russian opinion polls because it's a different sort of society. It's highly controlled, and bad news doesn't really travel at all. So my sense is that I would imagine in the capitals or in the major cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow in particular, the war hasn't really affected their standards of living and lifestyles and wealth to some extent. But out in the rural areas, which are largely disconnected, as we know, where many of these troops come from, those are not really connected into the political debates of Russia. So perhaps they're not reading Ukraine because they've had no necessity to read Ukraine. It's somebody else's war, and it's a long way away, it's far away, it doesn't really affect me. It's not on their screens every night. It's not costing them their kids or the kids of their friends. And if it is, they're a long way out there too. But Russia will eventually suffer the manpower costs of this war, as indeed it probably is already suffering the economic costs of this war. But I'm afraid that's going to largely be a Ukrainian responsibility to do that. It's not going to be somebody else's. It's not going to be somebody else's job. But I say I was at Hostomel this morning. Most of the world thought that you would last a few days. Most of the world thought that genuinely you were going to collapse in the face of the Russian onslaught, this great mighty power. And I think people misread Russia as much as they misread Ukraine. Misread Ukraine because of its history, because of its deep attachment. You want to go back to the Holodomor, you want to go back to independence in 1918 or 1,000 years. Where do you want to start that discussion? But even in recent times, the Orange Revolution, Maidan, etc., there's a strong sense of purpose and of nationalism. And I find it very hard to imagine how that can ever be put back in a box again, ever simply forgotten about. It's now such a powerful force within the society. So I think maybe the Russians misread their capabilities, but they also misread Ukraine because they believed their own propaganda. But I don't think they believe, I can't imagine that they all believe that now. Even the elites, and given how difficult this is. But it doesn't mean that Ukraine is doing, it doesn't mean Ukraine is doing a bad job. It just, you have to ask yourself the question, can Ukraine do a better job? And it's not meant to be a criticism, it's just meant to try and find a way to assist more. And I think in the rest of the world you can do a better job, to go to the point about Africa, about anti-colonial struggle, anti-imperial struggle, about linking with people, about drawing on the past history, about wanting to be the master of your own choices and of your own destiny. That's very powerful for audiences around the world. And given the majority of the audience around the world were people who have been colonized, actually, at some point in their history, that's a very powerful message. So I'm sort of skirting around the answer, but I see scenario 1 and hopefully scenario 4 as being the most likely outcomes, that this drags on so long as Putin or someone like him with the same mindset is in power in Russia. The back?
Mr. Mills, good afternoon. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us, with Ukraine, and thank you for presentation. My name is Artem. I'm a 5th year student of international relations at Kyiv National University, and right now I'm conducting my internship on African studies in one of the analytical foreign policy Ukrainian centers. So my two questions are following the discussion of G20 summit and the South African presidency. How South African government sees Ukraine and builds in Ukraine in its global agenda for next summit, and how we can better our position in this agenda. And the second question, apart of this case, is there any other particular case where Ukraine with other African countries may put effort to gain mutually beneficial results in short-term future, maybe with such states as 10 fully free states, as you mentioned? Thank you.
Sorry, could you just repeat the second?
The second question,
Sure.
is there any case
Yeah.
which is out of sight right now, in which Ukraine and other African states, it may be South Africa or other states, can cooperate and gain tangible result in short-term future?
Okay, down here in the front. I'll take them all together. Good question, yeah?
Hello, firstly thank you for the presentation, it was really interesting. I have also two short questions. The first one, you have presented a few scenarios, but well, some of them offer Ukraine not a victory, but a peace. It can be the freezing of the war, which can give Russians as well as Ukrainians some time. But to Russian side, it can give them time to prepare better for the another trial. And the second question is about the countries in Africa which does not support Ukraine, where there is not just economic influence of Russia, but also the cultural propaganda, like countries like Ethiopia, where Russia already has some influence on people. And what tips you will give how Ukraine should work with these countries and with people of these countries?
There was one more over there.
Hi, my name is Dana. I'm from Kyiv Aviation Institute. First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. We are really glad to welcome you here in Ukraine. So my question is, how do you see the role of Ukrainian expert community, like think tanks or academia, in revisiting the Russian studies in British or Western think tanks? Thank you.
Any more? One at the back here. Making the microphone person run.
My name is Alexander, I'm a Ukrainian historian. There are two options I'd like to ask you on. The first one is about parallels of the Soviet Union invasion in Afghanistan and modern Russian-Ukrainian war. You spoke a lot about Afghanistan, so it is widely known that Soviet Union loss at the war was about 15,000 soldiers, and that was enough for the USSR to stop this war and quit the invasion. What was the dominant factor that enabled Soviet Union to stop that war? And the second one is about Russian influence in Africa. In 2022, Vladimir Putin put such a task to his historians to investigate profound historical connections between Russia and African states. He told it like this. Then, as a historian, I tried to recall some of those connections in my mind. So it was really too hard for me because there are none, in fact. But I have found two photos made in the end of 19th century when Russian aristocrats spent their vacations in Africa and demonstrated their cruelty towards local population. My question is, what about studying history of Russian influence to African population in African states? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that last round of questions. I'll try and group some of these together, but let me start with the first one about South Africa and Ukraine. I mean, I'm wholly embarrassed by the African government's position on Ukraine, because in 1993, Nelson Mandela, before he took power in South Africa the following year, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine where he said that human rights will be the light that guides our foreign affairs. And if you think about Ukraine and its wars with Russia and the Russian invasions and the absence of any critique from South Africa on the one hand, but actually the almost wholehearted diplomatic endorsement of South Africa for Russia on the other, it's simply embarrassing because it undermines the struggle, it undermines the assistance that was given to South Africa by many people across the world, but fundamentally it undermines South Africans. It undermines us as a group of people in terms of the attachments and the ideas that we, excuse me, as a nation have dear. So we've not only abstained on key resolutions, but we have conducted naval exercises with the Russians, had parties with the Russians at key moments in the conflict, and those have been publicly demonstrated and filmed and publicized. And most recently, our defense minister was in Russia over this weekend, for instance, but there was no defense minister in Ukraine. Is there a way back? Well, I think the way back is largely in the way in which civil society in South Africa goes about pressurizing the government. Myself and my colleague Ray Hartley, since this war began, have written over 100 articles in the international and local media about the illegitimacy in every respect of Russia's actions in Ukraine. These songs gathered more than 25 million views on YouTube. In total, our readership on the Ukraine war has been more than 1.6 billion people over the last 3 years. So, and I think that people have said that what we have done is put the spotlight on the South African government to be in a much more uncomfortable position with respect to Ukraine. And to go to the question about think tanks, I think there's a great deal of commonality between think tanks because we learn from what you have done and how you do it. But I'd like to think that you perhaps learn from some of the things that we have done and how we go about doing it, how we pressurize governments, how we hold them to account, how we write about them when they make missteps, how we work with the media to highlight these issues. In terms of common approaches, there's a lot that Ukraine and South Africa can do together, but we would have to shed our history in believing that Russia is the sole inheritor of the Soviet legacy towards Africa, and we would have to adopt a much more human rights centric approach, and one that's in support of international law and a rules-based international system than we have demonstrated in the last 3 years. So I think that there's massive potential in the relationship with South Africa, not least equipment, not least resources, not least using each other as a hub for various activities. But you're going to have to get past the war, and we're going to have to get past our interpretation of the war first. The big advance that we've had in South Africa is that in April-May 2022, we brought John Steenhuisen, the leader of the opposition to South Africa, to Ukraine. It was a very unpopular act at the time. A lot of people said, "Why are you doing that?" Well, he is now the Minister of Agriculture. He is the key partner in a government of national unity for the ruling party. So he's very much a supporter of Ukraine. He absolutely is a fan. He's a strong proponent of the Ukrainian cause. But they don't really have much influence on foreign affairs yet. But over time, I think you'll see more and more opposition influence in the way in which government goes about its foreign policy. And in his particular ministry, with that of agriculture, there's an enormous amount of potential. And when President Zelensky visited South Africa for his very brief visit a couple of weeks ago, one of the practical discussions was about agriculture and how we can collaborate and export and share equipment and all sorts of things. The place to start with cooperation with African states is to start with those who support you, with those who vote with you, with those who are democracies. It's easier. They understand you. They understand the need for checks and balances and maintaining a rules-based international order. To invest massively in countries which are not democracies is a little like trying to plant a tree on Mars. It's very hard work, and it's probably not going to grow. And you're probably going to waste a lot of money going to Mars every now and again to try and make it grow and water it and fertilize it. It's just never going to grow. So rather invest in places that are aligned to you. If I was to do a thumbnail sketch, I mean, clearly you need the big countries, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa. You also need Kenya, Zambia, Botswana, Ghana, some of the countries that you're already focusing on. But don't expect the authoritarian countries to actually, it don't matter how much you invest in them, to adopt your position. They may hear you out, but they won't adopt your position. I think it'd be far more useful running trade missions with those countries, a lower level form of quasi-diplomatic mission, and raising the flag differently, working with civil society and so on. So on the question of scenarios, I just wrote down scenarios. Just repeat the question for me briefly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think I got it. Yeah, I mean, the problem with the scenarios is that most of them are a temporary peace and they are not justice. And that's going to be very hard for a Ukrainian leader to sell when you've had nearly 500,000 casualties admitted in this war. Very hard to say well, I suppose they died or were wounded for not to have the whole country occupied, of course, but you need a pathway to victory. And what's that victory look like? I mean, I think victory for Ukraine is defined very simply, which is two things. One is reunification of all of these territories in Ukraine back to its original borders. And secondly, a deterrence or a removal of the threat outside, or a management of the threat outside. That's victory. To hope for more than that, I think, would be a bonus, but the victory has to be in terms of removing the threat, either through international agreement or through rearmament or through whatever means you have available, and secondly to reoccupy the country. But I go back to the variable of time. How long is this going to take? What's the timeline? Can you give people a horizon by which this is going to occur? Can you maintain political buy-in according to that horizon, given the sacrifices that have been made? And that's a very difficult job for politicians. But to expect Putin to walk away right now, I think, is unrealistic. But you need a pathway to achieve that victory. And one of the things that the world needs to hear is what that victory looks like and what that victory entails in terms of international commitment. Because it's easy to say we must support the Ukrainians in terms of achieving their victory, and I heard that a lot this week at the Kiev Security Forum. What I didn't hear about was, and what sacrifices is that going to involve, and how are we going to convince our people to make those sacrifices? Because that's about more defense spending, it's about higher economic costs in places like Germany and so on and so forth. It's about making tough choices. And tough choices are a political discussion. So peace with justice is going to be a longer term process, I'm afraid. Peace without war, with a lower risk of war, is probably more likely in the shorter term. And then preparing for war to ensure that victory is going to be, and my fourth option scenario puts out, is going to be a key part of it. I'll just go, I'll come back to the other things in a moment, but why did the Soviets leave Afghanistan? I mean, I think the Soviets left Afghanistan because it was 1989. And firstly, they realized very quickly that they weren't going to ever defeat the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were only united on one thing, and that was against the Soviets, firstly. Secondly, they had made themselves a target for American assistance via Pakistan into Afghanistan. And in the Cold War context of the time, that was bleeding the Soviet economy. And it's not a bad analogy for what is happening here, except Afghanistan wasn't next door. Well, it was, I suppose, but it wasn't next door, like Ukraine is next door to Russia, with a different set of stakes, and hence the much greater commitment, close to 1 million casualties, as opposed to 15,000 dead. I don't know how many Russian dead have been suffered, but it's probably, if it's 1 million casualties, if you look at Ukrainian ratios of casualties to wounded, it must be, well over 150,000, 180,000 casualties on the same ratio. It may be a higher ratio, I don't know. People talk more in the 300 to 350,000 margins, which is 20 times the number that were killed in Afghanistan. So clearly, that's created a massive stake by Putin, and he's going to find it very hard to back down unless he can himself declare victory in some shape and form. How does he declare mission accomplished and go back home again? giving him an off-ramp from this conflict is very important. But the answer to the Soviets out of Afghanistan is the same answer to the Soviets out of Eastern Europe, which is they were broke. And people wanted Levi jeans and to drive Golf GTIs at the time, you know. That's my generation. You guys have a different generation. You want iPhones or something. But that's what they wanted, and they weren't going to get that in the current economic environment. It's different today because, you know, Russia's a relatively globalized economy compared to what it was. On Russian influences in Africa, I think the Russians work with elites. That's how they operate. They cut deals. It's a kind of lower grade version of China. Their tool of economic engagement is largely oligarchic investment in big operations in Africa or security. Whereas China covers the full spectrum of small investors, medium-sized investors, people doing infrastructure, big state-run companies running mines. Russia tends to be at the military area, which is military support. Africa Corps used to be Wagner. That type of operation, which is the Central African Republic, bits of Sudan, probably, and then across the Sahel, creeping into bits of West Africa. Then you've got oligarchs who are running big operations, who are doing big deals, and of course there's some arms trading on the back of all of this. So it's quite specific, it's quite elite-based, or it's quite security-focused. Of course, as was mentioned earlier, the Russian history of support for the anti-colonial struggle is well known, it's well documented. People like Vladimir Shubin and others have written about this extensively, Irina Filatova among others. I mean, it's a very interesting and quite detailed history. But they've largely inherited all the good bits and left aside all the bad bits. And I think the one, and I've neglected to mention this, the one big opportunity that Ukraine has is education. Because it's the golden thread in your society. And it's the golden thread that pulls in many African institutions. When I was at the border of Poland at Medinka, excuse me, on the 24th of February, the number of people that were coming out were African students who were studying in Ukraine. And I think that remains a very active market. It's relatively cheap and the standards are very high, as we know. So that provides a big opportunity for educational link-ups, for civil society link-ups, for relatively little cost. And that builds a future generation of talent. So I am a product of a scholarship to a British university. And of course I'm always aligned and orientated towards my British colleagues because that's where my education was obtained, my postgraduate education. And I think that provides a huge diplomatic cohort for Ukraine in the future. And I don't know if you've actually been able to exercise that connection fully and actually pull all those linkages, work out where all your graduates are in an African context and be able to develop that in the short term, build an African cohort of people who studied in Ukraine. So, I like to think that there's a platform existing already in Ukrainian-African relations. Many Africans admire you enormously for your courage and for your fortitude and for what you have done because your struggle looks like our struggle. Your struggle looks identical, actually, in many respects. So there's a common understanding already. So there's a very prosperous future in sight, which we've got to find a way to get past this current reality as best as possible. Thank you very much.
Yes, hello, Greg. My name is Gorberlian. I was at the meeting last August in Ukraine Forum, and I was asking a question about sanctions, because we remember that there were sanction regime towards apartheid during the Cold War. But right now I want to ask you, so right now I work at Kyiv Institute, and I'm very proud of my students who are here. And my colleagues, so I have a question about new security alliances in Europe, because we see a lot of changes after the start of the second Trump administration. And how do you see the opportunities for Ukraine to join small alliances, for example, JEF and other, because as you rightfully pointed out about NATO, so there are no chances for Ukraine to join NATO. So my question is, small alliances in Europe and Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, I do think, as I mentioned in the talk, that regional is beautiful, is the most likely route through this. And understanding your neighbors and understanding your neighborhood is absolutely critical in this regard and is the entree. But I don't think it only depends on what they do. It depends on the way in which Ukraine, and I use the term splice, it itself inserts itself in these regional production processes. I would venture that the one big thing that's happened, which we don't fully understand at all, but it's definitely happened, is that roughly 5 million Ukrainians live in Europe now? Roughly? Is that right? Now, many of them are young. Many of them are being schooled in Europe. What does that create as that force of European graduates, as a catalyst for closer European integration, as a business force with families here, with business interests in Europe, with skills and technology? It's an incredibly powerful hook, incredibly powerful dynamic within the European integration environment. You're not talking about theories of European integration. You're not talking about theories of security integration. You're talking about 5 million people who are integrated in Europe who happen to be Ukrainian. The extent of that integration depends largely on how long they've been there and how old they are. But that integration has already occurred. So I think you've got to look at integration at two levels. One is this level of what states do. Another is the level of what people do. And somehow they've got to kind of equalize in this process. So I can't imagine that the process of Ukrainian integration with Europe is stoppable. I think it's unstoppable as a force because of the 5 million and the children of the 5 million. And so it goes on. You're building up this incredibly powerful diaspora with all these potential business, educational, and other linkages. And I don't know how much, to what extent Ukraine has realized this. It's only been 3 years, but imagine the case in 10 years' time when many of those individuals mature, what this is going to mean for the Ukrainian economy. You've essentially got an extraordinarily powerful outlet. And I know it seems like a light eon away, 10 years away seems like forever. But it is a very powerful dimension to the integration process. On security integration, I just think that NATO itself and Europe as the sort of core centerpiece of NATO has so many changes to have to undergo now. One of which is Ukraine, the other of which is the realization that they're going to have to play a much bigger part in securing their own future than they've been willing to do up until now. Not that they've been able to do, that they have been willing to do. And if you read one speech over the last year, read the speech of J.D. Vance to the Republican convention. Basically what he says is, that game is over. People like me in Middletown, America, who played that part, who were essentially taken advantage of in globalization, in these security activities, we're not going to play that game anymore. We're going to play a different game. This is before they were elected, well before they were elected. So what's happened in terms of the relationship, you may not like it, but nonetheless it is a reality in terms of at least half of the American population who feel differently about European security that previous generations did. They're not willing anymore to sponsor it, to subsidize it. That game is over for at least half of America. So, and I think that's going to endure well beyond Trump. I think that language, that dialogue is something different. Now, that if Europe steps up to the plate, if Europe is able to take responsibility for that, for that different future, and is able to spend more, Ukraine's role in that as a defense enabler is front and center. So I think integration follows necessity rather than, integration being a necessity, which it is, but it follows the necessity of the way in which defense is heading. And Ukraine's abilities and its battle-proven nature and its asymmetric nature in terms of resource utilization is very important. The way in which you've offset a human availability with technology is a very big feature of this war. Again, one that has fully played out. So a big trend worth watching. And as this shakes out, as the war shakes out, as peace emerges out of this conflict, Ukraine's role at the center of European security, not just as a shield, but as an enabler, it's a very different role, very different thinking, I think is one, plus that 5 million people that are living abroad. It's a completely different outlook, it's a completely different vision. So I see that in quite exciting terms, in quite positive terms, rather than negative terms. Thank you. I do, sorry, just before I forget, I have left some extra copies of the last couple of books I've done, and we'll leave them with the organizers, and we'll let them distribute them according to I don't know whether it's a free market or a Soviet methodology, but I'll leave that up to you.
Thank you, dear guests, very much for your questions, for your activity, and we are very glad to see this activity here after such a thoughtful and meaningful lecture by Dr. Mills. Dr. Mills, thank you very much for coming to our museum. It's a huge honor for our team, for our institution. We hope that this discussion, which is raised by you on such worrying questions as war and peace, the questions that cannot leave impartial no Ukrainian now and no conscious person in the world. We hope that this discussion will continue, maybe in our museum, maybe on other platforms, and we are very grateful for your visit and your lecture. Thank you.